Hey guys, how you doing? Dan here, and it's great to see you all again. Today I wanted to show you 3 quick ways, I don't know what number that was, 8. Today I want to show you 3 quick ways to creatively control your depth of field. So we're going to have a look at how to make a really shallow depth of field and really isolate something in your scene. And we're going to have a look at how to get a really wide depth of field and have pretty much your entire scene in focus. Both have the uses for very different situations, and I'll go over those as well. I think the only thing left to do with this is to jump straight into it. Let's get going. If you guys ever had candle mint cake, it is so nice. My sister went to Grasmere the other day in the Lake District and brought some back, and it is so good. Anyway, I'm sure you guys didn't click on this video to see me eat candle mint cake. I'm sure you clicked on this video to learn more about depth of field. So guys, depth of field is the amount of your scene which is in reasonable focus. So a nice shallow depth of field is where just a little bit of your scene is in focus and your subject is extremely isolated from the background. If you look at me, I'm very isolated from the background. It's very clear I'm the focus of this shot and the background is nice and blurry. So your eye is kind of drawn into me because I'm the sharp bit of the image. I mean, that's great for some situations. It's great for some films. It's great for TV series. It's great for just going out and getting some nice B-roll of things. But what if you're out shooting landscapes and you want pretty much the entire scene in focus? So that would be a wide depth of field, and that's when pretty much your entire scene is in focus, and that's great for landscapes. It's also great for some photography situations where you might be taking a picture for a group of people and a shallow depth of field wouldn't get all of the eyes in focus. So if you just manipulate a couple of settings, that'll just mean everyone's in focus. But the main things here is a shallow depth of field isolates your subject, and a wide depth of field pretty much shows you the entire scene to you and your audience. You've got to think about where the focus is in the scene, which could be something like this. So the focus is here, or here, or it could be here, or here. So we've got that to think about, and we've also got how much of the scene is in focus. So it could be we're focusing here but this much of the scene is in focus, or we're focusing here but only this much is in focus. So that's a very shallow depth of field, and that would be a very wide depth of field. So the 3 things we're going to have a look at in this video are aperture and how that manipulates your depth of field. We're going to have a look at focal length as well. And finally, we're going to have a look at the distance between the camera, the subject and the background, and how that impacts the depth of field too. This morning, I did shoot some tests with some different lenses at different apertures and different distances. First of all, we've got aperture. So I shot this morning on a 50mm 1.4 lens. It's actually what I'm shooting this video on now. And I wanted to show you the difference between aperture 1.4, 3.5 and finally f11. So hopefully we're going to expect 1.4 to be really nice and shallow, and I'm going to be just isolated in the scene on my own. And then f11 we're going to expect to see more of the scene in focus. So let's have a look. So here is the first shot, and this is the 50mm 1.4. Now, as you can see, I am very clearly in focus. I am the focus of this scene, and we've got a really nice blurry background. It's so blurry, in fact, where my eyes are in focus, but my ears are actually out of focus. That is how shallow a depth of field is on a 50mm 1.4 lens. These posters in the background, you can hardly tell what they are. I mean, you could maybe have a guess what that is. Leave a comment down below what you think that is before seeing it. But here, you've got no chance of guessing what that is. If I was shooting this scene, I'd probably want the entire of me actually in focus, so I'd probably drop my aperture down a little bit to something like maybe f2.8 or 3.5, and hopefully my ears would be in shot then. Now let me show you what happens when I shoot at 3.5. I'm in focus now, and the background isn't as out of focus. So now you can see my ears are in focus. Brilliant, you can see my nice big ears. I'm sure you're all very pleased about that. But with the background here, you can see what this is now maybe a poster of a dog or a cat. You can see this might be a bee, and you can see a few more details on the frames behind me. So as we've made the aperture just a little bit smaller, just by going to 3.5, we've actually really widened the depth of field. A lot more of the scene is in focus. Now again, the background still is blurry, but we're definitely getting to a stage where more of the scene is in focus. And what happens if we go all the way to f11? This is what it looks like at f11. And as you can see, I'm definitely in focus now, and the background is not in focus, but it's also very clear what the background is. There is very little subject isolation here. So you can tell that this is a bee. You can even tell there's some words on the bee. You can tell this is a dog now. You can even tell there's some glasses on it. And you can see there's just not that much out of focus in the background. So this is just one of the ways of creatively controlling your depth of field, and that's just with Aperture. But I'm hoping you can see already what even just changing the aperture gives us such a difference in our depth of field. Something really, really cool, and it's something to play with. But I'm hoping you're starting to see what if we shoot at a low aperture, something like 2.8, 1.8, that's going to allow us to get a nice shallow depth of field. And if you're out shooting landscapes and you want a wide depth of field, we're just going to increase the aperture number to something like f11 or f15, 14, f14 it will be. So that's the first way of creatively controlling your aperture. What about when we start changing the focal length of the lens? Both these next ones are shot on the same lens. So this was a 16-35mm f4, and I've kept the aperture the same on each test, just so you know there's no cross-contamination with the test results. So here we're at f16, no we're not, we're at 16mm. And as you can see, I'm clearly in focus, but the background, you know, it's not out of focus again, but you can very clearly see what's going on. You can see my two cats here being naughty, jumping on my camera bag, jumping on the shelves where they're not allowed. And we've also got a fish tank here, so you can start to see a lot more of the scene. So if you was a filmmaker and you wanted your audience to see a lot more of your scene and a lot more of what's going on, this is a great way of doing it. But then if you increase your depth of field, let me show you here. So now this is the same lens, still at f4, but this is now at 35mm. You can see that the background has started to go a little bit out of focus again. So I'm very clearly in focus, my ears are in focus. The background, it's still out, it is out of focus. You can still see some details in the background, but it is looking quite nice and out of focus. This comes in really, really handy if you've got a lens. Maybe you've got a, let's say an 18-200mm Sigma, or you've got some other lens which starts at f4, maybe f5.6, or even 6.3. And you can't get to that lower end of the aperture scale with, you know, 2.8, 1.8. But this shows you that you can still get a really nice shallow depth of field. If you've got a 200mm or an 85mm and you shoot at, you know, 5.6 or f4, you will still get a really nice shallow depth of field. Just increase your focal length and you will increase your shallow depth of field. And finally, number 3, so this is the distance between the camera, the subject and the background. Now I'm about, let's say, a meter away from the camera at the moment, and the background's quite nicely out of focus. But if I come a little bit closer to the camera, you can see my sunburn. I was actually out in the Peak District at Mamtor, going up Edale the other day, and didn't put enough sun cream on, but the closer I get to the camera, the more depth of field there is and the blurrier the background gets. But if I go further back that way, there's less and less depth of field, so the scene's getting wider and wider. So again, if you don't have the super high-end fancy lenses, all you need to do is zoom in on your lens, get the camera as close to your subject as possible and make sure there's a lot of background space behind them. You will get a nice shallow depth of field, I promise you, you will. So this is really, really good if you are shooting on cheaper lenses. Now let me show you the example of this. So this is at 35mm at f4. So this is me stood about a meter from the camera, and as you can see, the background is reasonably out of focus. But when I step back, maybe about to 2 meters, double the distance I was before, we start to see where everything's in focus. The background's in focus. You can even see my washing, what I've not done this morning. There's the cafetiere, you see the kettle, you see the washing machine. You can see everything in the scene. So shooting your subject further away from the camera and closer to the background definitely gives you a wider depth of field in your scene. And finally, let me just show you this. So this is me walking from 2 meters to 1 meter, and even just getting close to the camera, you can see the depth of field change in the scene, and you can see it really isolate me out in the end, which is absolutely brilliant. So that's pretty much it. That's the 3 creative ways to creatively control your depth of field. So first of all, we've got the aperture. Now just remember, a low aperture number like 1.8, 2.8, 3.5 is going to give you a really shallow depth of field. And if we do that the opposite way around, an aperture of f11, f16, maybe f18, that's going to give you a really wide depth of field and get everything in your scene in focus. Then we had a quick look at focal length. So just remember, a wide focal length, something like 16 or 24 millimeters, is going to give you a wide depth of field, and a higher focal length, something like 85, 100, 200, even 50, that's going to give you a more shallow depth of field. So you can start to see how all these intertwine, and you can start to get your creative results. And finally, we've got the distance between the camera, the subject, and the background. The closer your subject is to the camera and the further they are away from the background, the more depth of field you have. So if you're out shooting landscapes, you probably want a wide angle lens to give a nice wide depth of field. Then you're going to want a high aperture number, something like f11. We don't want to go too much higher because we're going to get a little bit of diffraction. And then finally, we've got the distance. So we're going to want to be as far away as possible, which in landscape photography we do tend to be anyway. So that's going to increase that depth of field as well. If for the opposite we wanted to do a really emotional scene in a film, there's a tear dripping down an actor's face and we really want to isolate that tear, we're going to want to shoot at a low aperture, something like 1.8. We're going to want a really high focal length on our camera, something like 85 millimeters, and we're going to want to get the camera as close to the tear as possible and get the background as far away as possible. And we're going to have a really emotive tear then. Just be careful when you're putting people close to your camera or objects. Your lens will have a minimal focus distance, and if you go past this minimal focus distance, you're going to start to go out of focus as you get closer to the camera. So just bear that in mind. Every lens has one, and it'll just save a minimal focus on the actual lens of the camera. Anyway guys, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new about depth of field and creative ways to control it. But guys, I think all what's left to say is thank you for watching, thank you for supporting the channel. I greatly appreciate it. I can't wait to see you all in the next video guys, and I will see you there. Cheers.